Picture this scenario. You're watching the news and you see another leader making a decision that will obviously backfire. You're scrolling social media and your well-meaning aunt shares another conspiracy theory. You're at work and your co-worker confidently gives advice that would bankrupt anyone who follows it. What do all these people have in common? They're not evil masterminds twirling their mustaches. There's something far more dangerous. They have catastrophically poor judgment. But they're absolutely convinced they're right. Take the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. Many blame the Soviet Union's secrecy and dysfunction, and rightly so. But the true catalyst wasn't sabotage or evil intent. It was experienced engineers running a safety test they thought was harmless, supervisors pushing for production targets, and officials delaying evacuation to avoid panic. Every one of them believed they were doing the right thing, and that's what made it so catastrophic. This wasn't evil. It was something far more common and far more dangerous. Sincere stupidity. Research from Cornell University shows that people with lower cognitive ability in specific domains often display extreme confidence in their incorrect beliefs, a phenomenon known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. But what makes this truly dangerous is that these individuals don't just harm themselves, they unintentionally destabilize entire systems, often while thinking they're helping. And in today's hyper-connected world, the reach of poor judgment has never been greater. This is precisely the danger Italian historian Carlo Cipolla highlighted, that the most harmful people aren't those with evil intent, but those who unknowingly create disaster through their misguided confidence. Before we dive into the psychology behind this phenomenon, we need to understand how today's information environment has turned individual bad judgment into a global crisis. Social media algorithms don't optimize for truth, they optimize for engagement. This means the most confident, emotionally charged content gets the most visibility, regardless of accuracy. A groundbreaking 2018 MIT study analyzed the spread of information on Twitter and found something alarming. False information spread 6 times faster than true information. But here's the kicker. It's not bots doing most of the sharing. It's real people who genuinely believe they're helping by spreading important information. This pattern isn't limited to one platform. A 2019 study by New York University and Princeton found that false stories were shared 6 times more often than true ones on Facebook, especially during the election period. The Reuters Institute's research, including their COVID-19 analysis across 40 countries, shows that most misinformation isn't spread by malicious actors, but by ordinary people who genuinely believe they're helping. These aren't calculated campaigns, they're organic expressions of poor judgment amplified by systems built for engagement, not truth. The psychology behind this is fascinating and terrifying. When people encounter information that confirms existing beliefs, their brains release dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in addiction. Sharing information that feels true literally feels good, regardless of accuracy. People with poor critical thinking skills become more susceptible to this neurochemical reward system, creating feedback loops where bad judgment becomes self-reinforcing. Think about your own social media experience. How often have you seen someone share an article based purely on the headline without reading the content? How many times have you witnessed intelligent people in your life fall for obvious scams or conspiracy theories when they operate outside their areas of expertise? This isn't stupidity in the traditional sense. It's systematic cognitive misalignment amplified by systems designed to exploit our psychological vulnerabilities. Now that we understand how modern technology amplifies poor judgment, let's examine the framework that explains why this pattern is so persistent and dangerous. In 1976, Italian economic historian Carlo Cipolla published what would become one of the most penetrating analyses of human decision-making ever written, The Basic Laws of Human Stupidity. His work wasn't meant as satire. It was a serious attempt to understand why intelligent civilizations consistently make decisions that undermine their own prosperity and stability. Chipola's first law states that everyone always underestimates the number of people with consistently poor judgment in circulation. Even the most realistic among us overestimate human rationality, assuming that most people, when presented with clear evidence and logical arguments, will make reasonable decisions. We project our own thought processes onto others, assuming they'll weigh evidence the way we do. His second law reveals something uncomfortable. The probability of poor judgment is independent of any other characteristic: intelligence, education, social status, wealth. None of these protect against systematic errors in reasoning. Self-defeating actors are distributed equally across all segments of society, from the homeless to Nobel Prize winners. This means you can't identify people prone to poor judgment by looking at their credentials or achievements. The third law defines the phenomenon itself. A person exhibits this destructive pattern when they cause losses to others while deriving no gain and possibly incurring losses themselves. This distinguishes poor judgment from mere selfishness or ignorance. A selfish person at least benefits from their actions, making their behavior predictable. Someone with poor judgment creates lose-lose situations while thinking they're being helpful. The fourth law declares that rational people consistently underestimate the damaging power of those with poor judgment. We fail to prepare for the chaos that self-defeating decisions can unleash precisely because their actions seem so illogical. We think, surely no one would actually do something that harmful to themselves and others. And then we're blindsided when they do exactly that. The fifth law states that individuals with consistently poor judgment represent the most dangerous category of person. More dangerous than criminals, more dangerous than the corrupt, because their behavior is unpredictable and often appears virtuous. This is the key insight that changes everything about how we view social problems. Chipola's analysis becomes particularly illuminating when he categorizes all human actions based on their outcomes for both the actor and others around them. Understanding these categories helps us predict behavior and design better systems. Intelligent actors create win-win situations. These are civilization builders who solve problems in ways that lift everyone up. Jonas Salk refused to patent the polio vaccine, saying, "Could you patent the sun?" Tim Berners-Lee could have become incredibly wealthy by patenting the World Wide Web, but chose to make it freely available. These people understand that creating value for others ultimately creates more value for themselves. Bandits harm others for personal gain. While morally questionable, their behavior follows rational patterns we can predict and defend against. A CEO cutting safety corners for quarterly bonuses or contractors using cheap materials for higher profits. Their self-serving actions are manageable through regulations and oversight because we anticipate this behavior. Helpless individuals harm themselves while benefiting others. These chronic self-sacrifices give without considering consequences, often enabling destructive systems. Think of colleagues who always accept extra work until they burn out, or parents who sacrifice their well-being so completely they eventually can't help their children. Healthcare workers who work to exhaustion during crisis reduce their long-term capacity to help patients. When dedicated employees consistently work unpaid overtime, they enable unrealistic expectations that hurt everyone. Then there are the stupids, people who consistently create lose-lose situations while believing they're helpful. They harm both themselves and others with a remarkable consistency. Here's a perfect example of this. During measles outbreaks, some parents refuse vaccines, fearing a link to autism, even though that claim's been debunked. They're not trying to cause harm, they're just scared. But their decision helps the disease spread. Their kids get sick, other people's babies get sick, sometimes kids die. The parents gain nothing. They waste money on fake treatments and end up hurting everyone, including themselves. Studies on moral decision-making show people with poor reasoning abilities often make choices they genuinely believe are ethical, even when creating measurable harm for everyone involved. They lack the cognitive architecture to trace the full consequences of their actions, but possess enough moral conviction to act decisively on incomplete understanding. Here's the crucial insight. Stupidity is more dangerous than banditry because it's unpredictable and often disguised as virtue. When you face a bandit, their motives are clear. They want to take something from you, and you can prepare or defend yourself. But stupid people act like chaos agents. They may support policies that harm their own families or spread dangerous misinformation, all while genuinely believing they're doing good. The Dutch tulip mania of 1637 perfectly illustrates this. Ordinary citizens sold homes and businesses to buy tulip bulbs, genuinely believing they were securing their family's prosperity. These weren't greedy speculators. They were responsible parents who thought they were making smart investments. Their good intentions created one of history's first economic bubbles, destroying thousands of family savings. What makes this pattern particularly destructive is how it multiplies. Unlike malicious behavior that creates opposition, poor judgment often appears virtuous. When your trusted neighbor shares misinformation out of genuine concern, you're more likely to believe it than if it came from an obvious scammer. Research on belief persistence shows that people with poor reasoning skills become more convinced when encountering contradictory evidence. They resolve cognitive dissonance by dismissing challenges to their beliefs, creating an armor of wrongness that strengthens with each attack. The Salem witch trials demonstrate this dynamic perfectly. Community members genuinely believed they were protecting neighbors from supernatural threats while systematically destroying their own social fabric. Each execution seemed to validate their fears, creating a feedback loop of destruction driven by good intentions. What Chipola terms stupidity often stems from emotional drivers rather than pure cognitive limitations. Fear, identity protection, and social belonging frequently override rational analysis. When people feel threatened, they make decisions that seem protective in the short term but prove self-defeating over time. This explains why domain-specific stupidity exists. A brilliant engineer might make excellent technical decisions but fall for obvious financial scams. A successful CEO might navigate complex markets while sharing political misinformation on social media. Poor judgment isn't always fixed. It emerges when people operate outside their expertise or when emotions run high. Recent research on motivated reasoning reveals that our brains are designed to protect existing beliefs rather than seek truth. When information challenges our worldview, the brain's threat detection activates. The response isn't careful evaluation, it's finding ways to dismiss contradictory evidence. This psychological feature served us well in small tribes, but creates massive problems in complex societies. There's also a crucial distinction between individual poor judgment and systems that promote it. Sometimes people aren't lacking reasoning ability. They're trapped in systems designed to exploit cognitive vulnerabilities. Smart engineers create addictive social media algorithms as rational business solutions. Yet these systems amplify poor decision-making across entire populations. The Roman Empire exemplifies this perfectly. Each generation of leaders debased currency to fund popular programs, genuinely believing this strengthened the economy, despite clear historical evidence otherwise. The system itself rewarded decisions that felt good immediately but proved catastrophic long-term. Some might argue this framework is elitist or that calling outcomes poor judgment becomes circular reasoning. Fair points, but the goal isn't to create hierarchies, it's to understand why good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. We all occupy the stupid category sometimes, and recognizing this shared vulnerability is the first step toward building better systems. If poor judgment is both persistent and dangerous, how do we build sustainable institutions? The answer lies not in expecting people to reason better, but in designing systems that minimize the damage poor decisions can cause while maximizing the benefits of good judgment. Pre-mortems in project planning force teams to imagine failure scenarios before they occur, helping identify potential problems when they can still be prevented. This simple technique acknowledges that even smart people miss obvious problems when they're excited about a project. Wikipedia's citation requirements create quality control even when editors have strong biases. By requiring verifiable sources, the system compensates for individual limitations while harnessing collective knowledge. Aviation's checklist protocols prevent experienced pilots from making simple but catastrophic errors. Even experts follow step-by-step procedures because human memory is unreliable under stress. Independent regulatory bodies like central banks operate with insulation from political pressures, allowing them to make unpopular but necessary decisions without being influenced by short-term political considerations. Democratic institutions themselves exemplify this approach. They don't assume voters are perfectly rational. They assume voters will often make poor decisions and build in mechanisms like separation of powers, term limits, and judicial review to prevent any single bad decision from destroying the entire system. Well-designed markets operate similarly. They don't assume perfect information or rational actors. Instead, they build in protections like bankruptcy laws, consumer protection regulations, and diversification requirements to prevent individual poor judgment from causing systemic collapse. The most important insight from Chipola's work may be the need for intellectual humility. His laws suggest that we all participate in poor judgment more often than we'd like to admit. The people who will successfully navigate the future aren't those who expect humans to be perfectly rational, but those who understand human limitations and design around them with wisdom and compassion. This requires a kind of moral complexity that our culture often struggles with. We need to simultaneously care about people's well-being while recognizing that decision-making abilities vary significantly. We need to protect democratic principles while building safeguards against democratic failures. We need to respect human dignity while designing systems that don't rely entirely on human wisdom. This isn't about creating hierarchies based on intelligence. It's about acknowledging human limitations and designing around them wisely. The French aristocracy before the Revolution weren't primarily evil. They were largely people who had inherited systems they didn't understand and made well-intentioned but catastrophically poor decisions that led to their own destruction and massive social upheaval. They couldn't see beyond their immediate circumstances to understand how their actions would ultimately destroy the very system that sustained them. Perhaps most importantly, we need to recognize that cognitive vulnerability is a shared human condition. Understanding our collective susceptibility to error isn't cause for despair. It's the foundation for building more resilient and compassionate institutions. When we accept that poor judgment is a persistent feature of human societies, we can work to create systems that harness our collective intelligence while protecting against our individual and collective failures of reasoning. Carlo Cipola's analysis forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The greatest threats to human flourishing often come not from malicious actors, but from ordinary people making well-intentioned but poorly reasoned decisions. This doesn't mean we should abandon efforts to build better societies. It means we need to be more realistic about human nature and more sophisticated in our institutional design. The people who will successfully navigate the future aren't those who expect humans to be perfectly rational, but those who understand human limitations and design around them with wisdom and compassion. They can hold two ideas simultaneously: that every person deserves dignity and respect, and that not every person possesses the cognitive tools to make complex decisions effectively in all domains. Recognizing our shared vulnerability to error is the first step toward building a wiser world. When we understand that poor judgment is a persistent feature of human societies, we can work to create systems that harness our collective intelligence while protecting against our individual and collective failures of reasoning. Think about your own experience. Where have you encountered stupidity-resistant systems that actually work? Maybe it's a workplace policy that prevents common mistakes, or a technology feature that makes it harder to share unverified information. These examples matter because they show us that we can design around human limitations without giving up on human potential. Understanding that the most dangerous people aren't evil but simply prone to systematic errors in judgment changes everything about how we approach social problems. Once you see this distinction, you'll never view human institutions the same way again. The question isn't how to eliminate poor judgment, it's how to build systems wise enough to work despite it. And if that idea struck you, if it helped you see something in a new light, or reminded you of a conversation worth having, consider sharing this video. Wisdom doesn't spread on its own. It travels person to person. And sometimes all it takes is one thoughtful share to strengthen a system just enough to resist a very old kind of failure.